So, a few weeks back, the Blood Wave build was becoming pretty popular for necromancers in Diablo 4 PvP. And at the time, I did make a Blood Wave build, but since then, I've been constantly tweaking and testing things for the build, and that's changed quite a bit from my previous video. For the build, I have been trying to focus on making it as viable as possible when fighting without mobs, specifically in duels or tournaments. So today, I'm going to be sharing my build and everything I've learned through testing on what I think is the best necromancer build for dueling. While necros are still considered weak in PvP, and that has been the case for me when we're talking about very competitive dueling. But generally in the PvP fields, when I'm meeting random players, a lot more casual players, I'm pretty much crushing everyone I come up against. And of course with open world dueling, the added benefit of mobs actually makes necros one of the strongest classes in PvP in my opinion. I know this update has been a long time coming, so let's just jump straight into these skills first. So for the skills, a couple main things have changed. First, we're not going to be taking a basic skill on our hotbar. We still have to put in 2 points just so we can move on in the tree, but I decided not to utilize the basic skill so that we have more space on our hotbar for other skills. Next, I switched into Blight instead of Sever. And for Blight, I generally like to use Paranormal Blight to have a chance to immobilize. However, versus Barbs, I actually prefer Supernatural Blight, so I'll switch that over if I'm dueling a Barb instead. That's just because Barbs are just super tanky and we're gonna need that damage. The reason I decided to go with Blight instead is the lucky hit chances from Blight are much higher, which allows us to create more corpses and apply other lucky hit effects. And because we don't take Sever, we don't need critical strike damage, saving us a couple Paragon points on our boards so that we can use them on our dot damage instead. However, versus Sorks, I still kind of like the Sever option better because we don't actually need our dot damage to be extremely strong, and more sources of damage is actually more beneficial. So if you prefer Sever, then I'd recommend going back to my old build, but versus classes like Barbs, I really can't live without the Blight, so I'll be taking that for this build. Next, we are now pumping as many points as we can into Blood Mist in order to get its cooldown as low as possible. Even though each point of Blood Mist gives diminishing returns, the cooldown of Blood Mist is just too important because it's our only safety measure as necros. The next major change is going to be for Bone Prison. It's going to be able to generate corpses and applies a vulnerable, so its offensive applications are far and wide, but it's actually also useful defensively. If you happen to drop a Bone Prison around yourself, it can actually help prevent your opponent from jumping on top of you, especially if they're a Barb, and sometimes a Rogue too if they accidentally shadow step onto the Bone Prison instead of yourself. And sometimes that Bone Prison is gonna be the few seconds you need to buy time between Blood Mists. Everything else is going to be pretty much the same and pretty standard when it comes to necros. We're taking Decrepify and Tendrils and all that jazz. And finally, of course, we're taking the Blood Wave, which is going to be our main damage source for the build. And now let's take a look at the gear. I will be going over all the aspects, and I do have some aspect switches as well depending on the class I am playing against. But I would say the affixes are probably something you're going to want to focus on even more, as I see a lot of more casual players tend to undervalue these affix slots, but the stats you'll be getting from these are going to be probably even more important than aspects in some cases. And though even on my gear I don't have the perfect affixes yet, I will let you guys know which ones are the most important ones that you need to focus on. So for the helm, we are taking the Exploiters aspect. Not too much to say there, but for the stats, you really want to get as high of a cooldown roll as you can. In dueling, everything hinges on being able to stay alive with Blood Mist, and so we need as much cooldown as possible, and our main damage is also our ultimate, which is Blood Wave, having a long cooldown, which means cooldown reduction is all that more beneficial. Besides that, I would recommend max health and total armor. I do have damage after picking up Blood Orb, which does come into play, but I would have preferred intelligence here. And from my testing, intelligence does in fact affect the damage of our Blood Wave, including the dot damage from the aspect. And now for the chest piece, where we are taking the Explosive Mist aspect. It reduces our Blood Mist cooldown when we pop a corpse with it, so it's a pretty no-brainer here. Other than that, defensive stats are going to be great here, and I prefer damage versus close, max life, and total armor. I could probably drop the intelligence for some more defensive stats, so if I happen to find a chest piece with that, I'll be picking those up. And next for the gloves are going to be the Fists of Fate. And sadly, this unique might make or break your build. It's going to be pretty difficult to farm out a pretty high roll for the gloves. Right now I'm rocking a 280%, but I'd still wish I had the 300% just for the higher consistency in Fists of Fate. Now I want to break down exactly how Fists of Fate work and exactly why we're taking it. So the TLDR of these gloves is that they can either make your next attack really weak or insanely strong, to the point where you're one-shotting barbs before they can even heal sometimes. And these gloves are going to be the most important in the barb matchup. Versus really well geared players, you're going to need these gloves in order to break through their sustain. Otherwise, a lot of barbs might just out heal your dot damage, and these gloves are going to allow you to be able to tick for crazy amounts of damage like 20-30k for a single tick of dot damage. Now, technically, you don't actually need these gloves to fight other classes like Sorks and Rogues. And versus Sorks, I actually don't recommend these gloves. I'd prefer the consistent damage, and Sorks are pretty squishy anyway, so most Blood Waves are going to be able to kill them regardless. But versus Rogues, I've come to highly prefer these gloves. Keep in mind that Blood Wave leaves an area of damage over time, which means your opponent probably has to stand in there at least for a couple ticks. And Rogues are so maneuverable that you might not be able to get them to stay in one place for very long. And that's where the possibility of rolling a high damage percentage on your Fist of Fate during a fight can instantly kill a rogue within the first tick and surprise them before they can even react. In addition to that, you also have these stats that give you a lucky hit chance to daze and to immobilize, and these are pretty important stats if you want to hold a rogue down. And for those reasons, I like using Fist of Fate in my general gameplay. Now, if you're gonna copy this build and you don't have a high Fist of Fate roll, then I probably wouldn't use those gloves. So unfortunately, you're probably gonna need these uniques if you want to fully emulate the build. The other option is just to go for gloves with lucky hit chance and damage over time, and then I would probably add something like Edge Masters or maybe the Dan aspect and trying to fit Iron Maiden into your hotbar instead. And now moving on to the next item, which is our pants. You're gonna need to take 4 ranks into Blood Mist, and this is non-negotiable. As I said before, we need Blood Mist on as low of a cooldown as possible, and for the aspect, I am taking the bubble aspect, and generally in dueling, if you really want to try hard, you can switch your aspects in between a duel after the bubble pops, and the aspect I'm currently switching into is just the protector aspect. And next for the boots, I am taking the Ghostwalker aspect. I like the added mobility, and you're gonna need the movement speed bonus as well in the affect slot. For the boots, there's actually quite a few options. Versus barbarians, I prefer to take in a looting boot, just so we get a few more chances if we get caught out in a bunch of CC. And I have tried the penitent greaves as well, and you're gonna be able to do a lot more damage with the greaves, but I find that I really miss the extra evade charges, so it depends on how I feel that day, but usually I like to stick with Ghostwalkers instead of penitent greaves. And now on our amulet, one main thing that has changed is that we're moving our most important damage aspect onto it, which is Ultimate Shadow. This is going to make our damage a lot stronger and more consistent compared to our last iteration of the build, since 99% of our damage is coming from Blood Wave anyways. And for the stats, you're going to want to take movement speed and cooldown reduction for sure. Cooldown reduction I've already explained, and movement speed maybe isn't as important versus some classes, but it's overall very helpful. The +3 to Macabre skills I wouldn't say are 100% necessary, but I have grown to like it very much, and I've felt a big difference in the gameplay having it on. It only saves maybe 0.5 to 0.6 seconds, but every single millisecond in a duel can matter here. And finally, I also have the Sacrilegious Heart, so that we can pop our corpse explosions and corpse tendrils automatically. Now for the rings, these are the affixes that I prefer to run. As much vulnerable damage as you can get, maximum life, lucky hit chance, and some form of damage, which I prefer damage over time or shadow damage. And for the aspects, I am using Tidal, which lets our Blood Wave fire 2 additional waves, and that's going to be important for damage as well as spawning more blood orbs, which comes into our next aspect, which is Fast Blood, reducing our ultimate time for every blood orb we collect. And we are using the Decrept Heart so that we save a slot on our hotbar, as well as the Creeping Death Heart, just for more damage. And now for the weapon, we are going to be looking at our wand. And here I'm taking the Plunging Darkness aspect so that we get another application of our Blight for more lucky hit chances, and this also means that when we spawn a Bone Prison from afar, we have a chance to immobilize them as well, which can be pretty helpful in setting up for Blood Waves. And again, we're using the wand for the higher natural attack speed and for the lucky hit chance. On the wand, you're going to want to grab vulnerable damage and intelligence. I also like to take all stats, and yes, ultimate skill damage does improve the damage of our dots from our ultimate shadow aspect. However, one thing that actually doesn't matter is the item power of our wand. So don't worry about getting a high item power wand. It would help in boosting the damage of our other skills like Corpse Explosion or Blight, but most of our damage is from our Blood Wave, and more specifically our ultimate shadow aspect, that the item power isn't affecting that part of the damage calculation. So the affixes here are going to be a lot more important than getting any high item power for the damage per second stat. And that also goes for our offhand, which I am taking a focus again, mainly for the cooldown reduction. And for the stats, I also like to take additional cooldown reduction here along with lucky hit chance and some intelligence. Instead of resource generation, I would probably prefer all stats instead. And for the aspect, I am taking the blood soaked aspect to help with our mobility during Blood Mist. However, for the focus, I actually do have a switch that I prefer to run when I'm fighting barbs instead, which is a focus that has the blighted aspect. Again, barbs are super tough and we just need as much damage as possible. If you have all the pieces in the build, including cooldown reduction, points into Blood Mist, and lucky hit chance, you can actually fight a barb for an extended period of time without dying. And all those three stats basically get your Blood Mist cooldown as low as possible, so it's actually not too hard to activate the blighted aspect in a fight. Alright, now that we're done with gear, let's go over the Book of the Dead, which hasn't changed from the last time. We are sacrificing the Reapers for shadow damage, Cold Mages for vulnerable damage, and the Blood Golem for health. And now we can get into our Paragon board. So this is what my first board looks like, and I am taking the Amplify glyph. Now, if you plan not to run Bone Prison, then I would recommend the Sacrificial glyph. And the reason why we aren't normally taking the Sacrificial glyph is that Bone Prison actually does count as minions. So whenever we have our Bone Prison up, we lose our Sacrificial glyph bonus. So instead, I am taking Amplify. Another option is Blood Drinker, which lets you fortify for picking up blood orbs. And this is the more tankier option, but again, I've opted for more damage instead. And next is gonna be the Wither board, where we're taking pretty much all the nodes. And for the glyph, we are using the Imbiber glyph. It gives a good chunk of damage while healthy, and while I'm not actually a big fan of the conditional effect, and to be honest, I probably would switch it for something else, but I had a hard time giving up the extra healing from the potions, which helps a lot against other damage over time matchups such as Poison Rogues and even Fire Sorks. So because of that, I decided to keep it. If you guys prefer something with more consistent damage, I found the Abyssal glyph to be actually pretty decent here, as it's quite comparable damage-wise. And for our third board, we are taking Scent of Death, where we are slotting in our Scourge glyph. We are going to be maxing out the willpower here just to squeeze in as much damage as possible. And other than that, there's not too much more to say, besides that we're taking some health nodes along the way here as well. Coming back down here, we are taking our fourth board, which is going to be Flesh Eater. And basically, we're only using it to slot in a territorial glyph. Versus most classes, I don't think the legendary node of Flesh Eater will be necessary. However, I do like to take it versus Barbarian, so I will remove some points here and there in order to path into Flesh Eater if I know I'm going to be dueling a Barbarian, which is why we still want to have this board for easy access. And now for the next board, we are using the Bloodbath board in order to slot in our Exploit glyph. I used to use the Bone Graft board for the same reason, however I found that the pathing in Bloodbath actually saves you 1 Paragon point, so I'm going to be using this instead. And finally for the last board, we are using the Blood Begets Blood board so that we're maxing out our Darkness glyph. The build planner will be left down in the description if you guys want to take a closer look at anything I've talked about in the build. And for the most part, I think this is going to be the build that I'm going to be using for the rest of Season 1 until we hit Season 2. And finally, I want to give a shout out to my friend Larothma, or Espe on Twitch, who's helped me a lot in theory crafting and testing different things within the build. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments. That's going to be pretty much it for me, and I'll catch you guys in another video.